When people die, it's up to the rest of us, who are still here, to tell their life stories. That's how they live on. And that's why we call this podcast Immortalized.
Welcome back to Immortalized, where we talk each episode about how people honor and share the memories of those who've died, in obituaries, in sympathy notes, in memorials, and in their own grieving. I'm Steven Siegel from Legacy.com, the world's largest network of obituaries. And with me is my co-host, Legacy's news editor, Linnea Crowther.
Hi.
Linnea, what's new?
Well, I see that it's that time of year again when the National Newspaper Association announces the winners of its annual newspaper contest.
So for those who don't know, the National Newspaper Association is an organization that's been around for well over 100 years that represents a couple thousand local community newspapers from cities and small towns all across the country.
Yeah, these are those hometown papers whose reporters are out there every day in their own neighborhoods. They're not big TV media stars. These are the real journalists who do the kind of meaningful reporting that keeps people aware of what's going on around them in their own communities.
So every year, the National Newspaper Association honors the local reporters who've done exceptionally great work in a bunch of different categories. And one of those categories is obituary writing, reporting on some local neighbor's life story when they die.
This year, the first place winner in the NNA's obituary reporting contest comes from a small family-owned newspaper in rural Ohio called Farm and Dairy. The obituary is a really beautiful story about the life of an Ohio father and dairy farmer named Doug Dye, who passed away last year.
And the author of that story, Farm and Dairy reporter Rachel Wagoner, is here with us today. Rachel, welcome to Immortalized. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about the community you report on. Who is reading Farm and Dairy, and how do you figure out what stories are important for you to report?
We are a weekly agricultural newspaper based in northeastern Ohio. We get mailed to people's houses every week, and I believe we have subscribers in every single county in Ohio. We also cover Western Pennsylvania, little bits of West Virginia. And basically our readers are country folks, rural people living out in the country, and of course, farmers of all, shapes and sizes and sorts.
Tell us a little bit about Doug Dye, whose obituary you wrote. Who was he, and how did you come to write a story honoring his life?
Well, as it turns out, he was just the best guy. He was someone that I wish I'd known. And I didn't know him at all before I heard about his death. An old editor who worked at the paper for many years and who was really well connected in the community. She heard about what had happened to him, which was an accident at a livestock auction. A loose cow got out and it was one of his. He was trying to go catch it. And in the fray, he was run over by a truck and he died of his injuries. And it was just a total freak thing. So it was one of those things that because it happened kind of at a public place, news started to trickle out and spread pretty quickly. So we heard from an old editor that this had happened to this guy who was well known in the farming community and especially in the dairy community in Ohio. And at first it started out as kind of a hard news story trying to track down and confirm the details of what had happened. But after we figured out that there wasn't really much there, it was just a freak accident, no negligence, nothing like that. We switched modes to just sort of figure out if we could tell this guy's life, if his family, of course, would be okay with it. Because, of course, there would be, the regular obituary in the local newspapers. But just from hearing about him, it felt like we needed to do something more to honor his life in our newspaper. Since we are this isn't very humble, but people really consider us like the farmer's Bible in our area. They just love getting our newspaper every week, and it's something they really rely on. I mean, we've been around for over 100 years ourselves, so we're a real staple in the farming community here.
Does the newspaper typically include this kind of obituary, or was this a little bit of a departure?
We run obituaries as they come in for people, for farmers in the area, or as they come along, and usually they actually end up being kind of late because we just get them way after the fact. I don't know. We cover stuff like this as it comes up, and this,
Mhm.
for whatever reason, this felt like it felt different. It felt like it needed to be covered, if it could be, of course, because with things like this, you have to rely on the family wanting to talk to you, which was
Mhm.
a big hurdle to overcome with this one.
So, what was important to you as you were telling Doug's story?
To tell people what he was like in real life, not to give a glamorized picture of him, which that's in reading obituaries and editing them for at old jobs. Um, you can always tell sometimes, like when the obituary doesn't exactly maybe represent the person, or it represents a certain side of the person, but there's obviously something missing. So I really just wanted to tell Doug's story um, as he was. You know, he wasn't perfect or flawless. He had quirks. He, had funny things that he did that might have been kind of embarrassing to his kids, but like all of those things is what makes a person who they are.
Would you be willing to read the introductory section of your story?
Sure. I also just want to say, um, I submitted this for this contest on a complete whim. I just thought it would be really neat to win an award for best obituary because I love obituary so much, just personally. And I remember that I wrote this and I thought, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
It was a wonderful obituary.
A Dairyman Remembered by Rachel Wagoner. It's a busy day at Quality Quest Holsteins. Trucks come in and out of the long driveway. Koba Sires leaves, the milk truck pulls in, a triaxle dumps a load of sand. As all of this goes on, 3 generations of the Dye family gather around 2 picnic tables beneath the shade of a big maple tree in front of the family home. But there's one person missing. He was a glass half full type of guy, said Ben Simpson, describing his father in law, Doug Dye. Nothing bothered him, or maybe it did, but he would never put it on anyone else. Doug never got mad working cows. Well, that's not quite true, his kids say, but his threshold was much higher than most other dairymen. The foot trimmer said he actually looked forward to coming here, said Brian Winnery, one of Doug's 5 sons. Embarrassing, said Hannah Simpson, Doug's only daughter. I have so many pictures of him dancing at our wedding that are like, oh my gosh. He was always laughing, cracking a joke. He was way more patient than he probably should have been, said Jonathan Dye, another one of Doug's sons. They're recalling the man who was ripped suddenly from their lives, doing a routine task many farmers do. Doug was taking a cow to the Damascus livestock auction July 21st. The cow got loose as it was being unloaded and ran into a nearby field. Doug and one of the auction workers in a truck tried to corral it and keep it off the road. In the fray, Doug was run over by the truck and died as a result of his injuries. He was 58.
And from there, you go on to flash back in time and tell more of Doug's story from the beginning of his life.
Yep. Then I, talk about his wife and how they met and how they sort of built their family together. And at the same time, I'm telling the story of how they built their dairy herd together, because that's sort of, I guess, equally important in their lives, because they built this amazing award-winning dairy herd that was also, extremely productive, and people from all over just knew this farm and knew what they were all about. Which is a thing that you do probably only at an agricultural newspaper is talk just as much. And I realized this later. I talk about one of his dairy cows, and I say that she's an EX94 cow, which to someone not in the dairy world, and to me before I was an ag reporter, I have no clue what that means. But it basically means, like out of 100, she was scored very high for, her traits.
But that's a
I
detail that you know is meaningful to the people who are reading this story.
Right. And I
Yeah,
guess it shows that, it's meaningful to our readers, and it sort of shows that you got those details, and that these things were really important. And it really shows what kind of person he was, what kind of herd he was growing.
I thought it was fascinating to read an obituary that was really tailored to a pretty specific audience like that. It's not something that we see every day in the world of obituary writing, and it was really well done, I thought, and very interesting.
Thanks. I'm so glad because as I read it back through, I thought I think it went a little heavy on the dairy stuff, and some of that can be no, a lot of dairy stuff can be extremely confusing and intimidating and kind of boring. And I thought, I hope maybe this all pulls together somehow and comes through, and that people don't get lost in the middle with me talking about cow's udders and how they were scored an EX94 in the middle of this obituary,
It's
and
not
they're
an
not like
obituary that would appear in a big city newspaper, but that's not what it was written for?
right. Yeah. So no, I mean, know your audience.
Yeah. How did the people who knew Doug, how did they all respond to the obituary that you wrote after it was published?
Of course, dealing with grieving families is touchy and it can be difficult. And of course, not everyone wants to talk, and I completely understand that. But also, being a person who has lost loved ones, sometimes it can be sort of therapeutic to talk to someone else and to tell your loved one's story to someone else who didn't know them, so that you can really feel like they're still there. So I reached out to someone in the dairy community here, sent her a text to see if she could connect me with the family, to see if they would want to talk to me, to do sort of a just a story about Doug and his life. And then on a whim, on a total whim, I found Doug's daughter on Facebook and sent her a Facebook message, just kind of a cold message out of nowhere, to just to really explain myself in the first person, not through someone else. And I think between those two connections, having someone in the dairy community say, Rachel wants to talk to you, she's with Farm and Dairy, you can trust her, and then having me explain myself and having them kind of sit on it and think a little bit. Finally, then they agreed to sit down with me after the funeral, kind of after the big lift was over. And then so we sat down on this like gorgeous summer day at their dairy farm. And the whole family was still gathered there because of the funeral. And they pulled together some picnic tables. And I mean, we all just sat down together, sons and daughters in law, and like there's grandkids running around, and just, life on the farm is happening all around us at the same time. It was like really beautiful, and also probably bizarre for them to be doing this and be all gathered there, but without him there.
It's there's a way in which that sort of conversation to figure out what the story should say when it's written. It's almost like another part of a funeral, isn't it? It's sort of like a eulogy and a reception and a conversation all wrapped up in one.
Yeah, and that's so actually getting back to how it was received. One of Doug's daughter's friends was there whenever I had this conversation with the family, and I was there for probably an hour, and we talked about all kinds of things, and it was sort of awkward, but it was also really nice by the end, and I think we were all pretty comfortable with each other. But I gave a talk to one of Ohio State University's ag communications classes about a month later, just kind of talking about journalism stuff. And the daughter's friend was in the class. And so she had been there for the interview and then saw the story that came from it. And so she asked, how do you take like 10 people talking to you at once and then form it into this beautiful story that really represents this person that you never met? Which I thought, I'm not really sure how I did it, but that's like that's like a beautiful compliment, because that's,
Mhm.
I guess she felt like it was done justice, and I mean she would know better than I. I tried to do my best to do everyone justice in the story.
Well, reading it, I noticed that you did something that isn't especially common in obituary writing, but really made the story very powerful, which was that you tied together the narrative of his unexpected death with the tribute to his wonderful life. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that probably came from how the interview took place. I mean, had I just done it over the phone or, through a video chat, because this was still last summer in the midst of a lot of pandemic stuff and a lot of uncertainty, because I got to sit on their farm and like literally watch farm life happen around us as they're also grieving and trying to figure out how to move forward and in what way they want to move forward. It just felt really important to tell the family story as well. And also because Doug's death was so, it was a freak accident. It was completely unexpected. I mean, he was just doing a routine thing that farmers do every week. So, I mean, as much as it was a story about him, it was also about the family and like, what do you do after this happens to you? And, uh, how do you move on? And I guess coming from, being a grieving person at one point, you just wanted to, I wanted to honor those feelings as well for those people. Because sometimes after the funeral, it can kind of feel like you get forgotten about, like no one's bringing casseroles or flowers or like 10,000 trays of cookies anymore to your house. And you're just kind of alone there, but you're still grieving and feeling really bad and missing this person. So I wanted that to be, just recognized as well, that these people were still trying to figure out how to put the pieces of their lives back together.
Did you find that this reporting process, interviewing the family under these conditions when they're grieving, did it change the way that you interact with the people you're usually writing stories about when you're reporting things that are not an obituary?
I don't think so. I try to approach pretty much everyone with, just consideration, because you don't know what anyone is really going through at the time. And I think I probably started off this interview the way I start off a lot of them, which is pretty casually. But I'm sure I said something like, tell me about Doug. What was he like? And I mean, that's all you need to say. You don't need to be awkward or formal, because you just want to know what comes to the top of your head when you think about this person. Which really, that's the best way to put people at ease, I think, in any sort of interview situation, is to just, be conversational, be casual. I mean, it's not an interrogation. It's a conversation.
Right. You said earlier that one of the things that really emerged for you when you were working on the story was realizing, as you learned more about Doug Dye, that he was someone you wish you had the chance to know. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is? What was he like?
He was just your typical farmer, which is what I really loved, and that came through in his in talking to his family, especially, and this was part that I included in the story that sort of tied together how the family was dealing with the loss, but then also who Doug was. And I think for a lot of farmers, it was very relatable that Doug did most of the farm work himself. He milked the cows himself. He kind of had his own schedule and routine. And because of that, when things would break, he would put band-aids on stuff. And, I'll get to that later. I ordered the part. It's sitting around. I'll just get to it when I have time. And everyone, I mean, I think a lot of people everywhere do that, but farmers especially do that. Like, oh, I'll deal with that later. I got the part in, like, whenever I have time, which you never have time. So a lot of stuff just never gets done until it completely falls apart. And that's kind of what his family, when they all converged on the farm after he passed, they were just discovering all these weird little fixes that he'd done on things just to get by for the day or the week until he got more time. Which just, I mean, it just shows what kind of person he was. He was just this, he was doing things on his own. He was trying to get by, maybe with some duct tape or a ratchet strap or something, instead of fixing it the right way. That was very relatable to me. And it's something I do on our farm. So yeah, it was just things like that. Or about, I guess if you're a farmer, then there's a lot of jokes about how it is to deal with family when you're working animals, especially working cows. And his kids said, that he never got mad when he was working cows, which, as a person who also raises cows, we have beef cattle, I related to that. I understand how things can get kind of tense when you're dealing with animals and you're trying to get things done in a certain way. And I think a lot of other farm folk probably did too. So it was just those little things like that, just those little details that I was like, oh man, this guy, he sounds like a real person. He sounds really relatable, like really fun. Yeah, and it just came through in all those tiny little details that they would mention.
Now, Rachel, I understand that you've seen kind of two sides of obituary writing, reporting as a journalist, and then you've also written an obituary for a family member yourself, right?
Yeah, I wrote my mother's obituary.
So can you talk a little bit about, how were those two kinds of obituary writing different for you, and how were they similar?
I'm going to say It's a lot similar. I approach it all in the same way. I lost my mother to lung cancer kind of very suddenly. She had a really fast decline over a couple of weeks around the holidays in 2014, around Christmas. And this was 4 months after I'd gotten married and a year after I got out of college and was just kind of starting my real adult life. So I remember sitting with her in hospice and she was unresponsive. And I was like, well, I guess I'm the journalist of the family, so I need to write the obituary. So I remember going on my computer, sitting next to her bed there and just looking up other obituaries to kind of get an idea of the flow and the format and kind of how it needed to look. And then just making sure I had all those basics that people expect, when and where they were born and family members. But then also, I wanted to make sure I included the things that made my mom who she was, like her love of the Pittsburgh Steelers and how she could make a friend out of anyone, which was always extremely embarrassing to me as a teenager when when we were shopping together for bras or something, and she's trying to tell the salesperson, you know, my whole life story, which now I appreciate because I do the same thing. And I mean, my kids are going to hate me for it, but it was just things like that you just want to mention, those little things that made the person who they were. And, you want to hit the high notes, what groups they belong to, the activities they did, where they worked. But I think it's really important to just include those little things about what they like to do or what they loved or how they were that show that they were a real person.
During the pandemic, it seemed families were really turning to the obituary as a place to tell these stories with all the more importance because they might not have been able to have a funeral at the time, right? And it seems like it's those kinds of little special, colorful details, that aren't the big facts of a life, that are the bits that have really tended to make obituaries especially memorable and especially shareable. Do you have those moments where you hear a detail and say, oh, whether you know it or not, this is the bit that everyone will respond to?
Yes. I mean, I'm sure other journalists experience this too, but as soon as someone says that small little offhand remark about the person, like, oh my gosh, that's how I'm going to lead the story, or that's how I'm going to, that's going to be the fun thing I need to make sure I include. I mean, as much as you want to recognize that the person was president of their local Rotary chapter for, 27 years or whatever, the fact that he would, always cook a certain dinner on Sunday, or he would always do certain things with his grandkids. I mean, that's the stuff that really makes it, and that just makes it a human and a person, and just makes you connect with them. This is going to sound a little morbid, but I've always loved obituaries, just reading them, because it's an encapsulation of a person's life. And unless you are, self-important enough to write your own autobiography, or you have a biography written about you because you're famous or important for whatever reason, all you get is an obit at the end. And that's sort of your record of you existing,
Right.
which is kind of scary. And it makes it feel sort of like that's a lot of pressure to put on this one little, I don't know, maybe 8-inch thing in a paper. So you want to make sure you have those things in there that make it seem like this was a real person, not just the president of this or the leader of that, or, just these sort of high marks. Like, who was this person? What was their nickname? Like, did they love I love it when people mention their dogs or their pets in their obits. Because I feel like that will be me. Hopefully, whoever writes that, hopefully they'll include that, because I mean, it shows what kind of person they were.
And we are never going to fault you for loving obituaries. You remember who you're talking to.
Oh, good. I'm in good company then.
We've talked a lot about this idea that most people don't get their life story told when they're alive. We just, in our society, we don't seem to have that as a formal tradition. There's maybe a case to be made that we shouldn't wait until someone has died to write their life story.
No, and of course, and I guess that's my role as a local journalist, is to find people's stories and tell them. And especially, it's usually the people who are sort of, they're hesitant to talk, or they're like, well, this doesn't matter that much. And I'm like, no, you're a person, and you're experiencing life. And I am so certain that like your story is fascinating in some way. I just love talking to people so much that, that's our role as local journalists, is to tell those stories while the people are still here to talk to us. And then it's also, that's why obituaries are there at the end, which I guess, at least from my experience, are a lot of the time sort of put together by family members or just put together by the funeral home. But it's really nice when you can tell that one was really personalized by a family member or by someone who knew the person, and you can just really, it helps you see what kind of person they were.
Rachel, I was wondering, having written both your mother's obituary and then journalistic obituaries for people you didn't know, do you have any advice for people who are faced with writing an obituary? Maybe for a loved one and have not done a lot of this kind of writing before.
I would say, I mean, I was a journalist for at least a year or so when I wrote my mother's obit, and I still found myself going to the local newspaper's website and looking up obituaries, sort of as examples to guide me about what I needed to say and how I needed to say it. So I would say don't be afraid to look for examples to inspire yourself, and then figure out how you can sort of apply your person into that. Because there is, of course, I mean, there's a format to obituaries that appear in the newspaper. So I would say just look for examples and use that sort of flow, and then use it to guide yourself. Just figure out how your person sort of fits into that model. Because that's what funeral homes are doing. They have like a format, put name here, age here, birthplace here, family members, spouses, how do you want to list all 10 of your cousins? Do you not want to? Do you want to list the pets' names? What groups were they in? And then just also think about some of those like little details about them that made them so great. Like, did they like baking? Did they like, what activities did they enjoy?
And when you're
Um,
when you're finding other obituaries online to kind of use as a model, you can often also find places to put in those little bits of personal story too, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, just look for, I mean, other people have done it. You're not starting from scratch. Luckily, there's, you know, at least 100 years of obituaries on the internet, if not
Hmm.
more. So there's a lot of stuff to look at to get ideas, and then you can think, "Oh, this is like I can apply this here, I can mention these things." You're not on your own. Like in funeral homes, they'll help you. They've done this before. If they're good, they should be helping you.
Hmm.
And we could also note that if you visit Legacy.com, this is a topic that Linnea and our colleagues have written advice about. There's a bunch of articles that you can find in our honoring a life category that provide some starting points on here are things to include, and here are examples of all different kinds of obituaries. What is it about obituaries, for you at least, that makes them such a powerful category of writing?
It is a person's life represented. I mean, if you go on Ancestry.com or any of those other heritage ancestry websites, there's a lot of public records, and a lot of the stuff is drawn from obituaries, from 100 years ago or 150 years ago. I mean, this is what shows that you existed as a person, which actually sounds kind of bleak in a way, because it might, that's the only way that some people might exist as a person. And I know that at a job where I did Saturday morning obituaries, some people just got death notices basically that said, what their name was, where they died, maybe where they lived, and that was it. So that's why obituaries are so powerful, because it's your chance to tell this person's story. And it doesn't have to be super long. It doesn't have to take up half of a page. You can really, drill down to the main points and what that person was like. And I guess that's what's so great about them, is it helps you kind of think about this person and to sort of boil them down into a few words. And how do I encapsulate this person's life that I loved so much in like 8 inches of a newspaper column? Like, how do I do that? So just, if you really think about it, how do I put all of this into words? So yeah, it's just, I mean, that's, in a weird and horrible but good way, like that's how it shows that you existed as a human on this earth, especially now since a lot of people are choosing to get cremated, so they're not going to have a tombstone in a graveyard somewhere that someone will look at, 200 years from now. Hopefully we will still have newspaper records in some fashion to show that you existed, and to show, who your family was and what you did and who you were.
It's like on the internet, the obituary really is the digital gravestone.
Yeah, Which, I mean, that's how I find it. Gosh, you can find so much information from people's obituaries. Just, different family connections and where people live, and which, now that I think of it, that sounds a little bit creepy. But I mean, all the information, it's there. It's part of someone's life, and it's, like my mother's obituary is part of my life. So whenever you would search for my name, that would probably come up, and then you would see that, and you would see kind of what person she was, and where she was and where I am. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just a way to mark a person.
We, of course, have people who use our obituaries for genealogical research, like you mentioned, but also with some of our obituaries for more notable people, we find so often that who is searching for those and getting information from them is students who are learning about that person's life for school.
Oh gosh, I had not even thought of that. Yeah, I mean, it's all there, and that's you're going to hit the high points. Unfortunately, with obits, you're only a lot of the times hitting the high points.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you get the basic details, and that's where that's where you're going to get them all boiled down is in the obit.
But I can absolutely imagine that someone wanting to look up what is the life of a dairyman like might along the way find your obituary, and they would then take Doug Dye's life as an answer to the question, what was a dairy farmer's life like?
Oh gosh, and it would be, of course, all farmers are different and all dairy farmers are different, but he was such a good guy, which I say just from talking to his family. I, of course, didn't know him, but just talking to his family, just all the things he did, and talking to his friends too. I mean, I talked to, actually, now that I think of it, I talked to several people that didn't even make it into the story, just sort of to get some background, to track down some other sources. So I talked to a lot of people, and they all had the same thing to say, basically. And it was what ended up there. It really gave me a feel for who he was, since so many people were saying the same things.
That's the point at which you can feel comfortable as a reporter that you've got it right.
Yeah, that's when you hope you don't find the one guy who thought he was like a total jerk, and then you're like, oh no, what do I what do I do with this one person who otherwise this guy has a sparkling life, and then there's one guy. But anyway, that usually doesn't happen.
On that note, that is our show for today. Thank you to Rachel Wagoner from Farm and Dairy newspaper. You can find her award-winning obituary as well as her other work at farmanddairy.com. Thank you also to Legacy.com, our host, where you can now honor a loved one's memory by planting memorial trees in their name. Just visit Legacy.com/trees. To hear about more life stories like these, you can subscribe to Immortalized on your favorite podcast app. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just look up Legacy.com on YouTube. And if you're on Facebook, you can follow Legacy.com there for daily updates. Thanks for listening.